Hello, and welcome to Amateur Bomb Museum, where we open up the world's most dangerous objects, poems. I'm your host, Victoria Brockmeyer, and I'm so happy you're joining me. In our first couple episodes, I'm going to go through two poems I like to use at the start of any poetry class, whether it's a writing workshop or a historical survey or whatever, because they each demonstrate a number of core ideas I come back to over and over again. We're going to start our journey into literary ordnance with a 1926 poem by Archibald MacLeish called Ars Poetica. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit, dumb as old medallions to the thumb, silent as the sleeve-worn stone of casement ledges where the moss has grown. A poem should be wordless as the flight of birds. A poem should be motionless in time, as the moon climbs, leaving, as the moon releases twig by twig the night-entangled trees, leaving, as the moon behind the winter leaves, memory by memory, the mind. A poem should be motionless in time, as the moon climbs. A poem should be equal to, not true. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway and a maple leaf. For love, the leaning grasses and two lights above the sea. A poem should not mean, but be. Ars Poetica, the title, is a Latin phrase meaning the art of poetry. The first use of it that we have is a work by the Roman poet Horace, written around 10 to 20 years before the start of our Common Era, which outlines how and why he thought poetry ought to be written. Eventually, the phrase became a general name for any text that takes up those questions, and so you'll hear people refer to some essay, or in some cases a poem, as so-and-so's Ars Poetica, whether it's titled that way or not. And then sometimes we'll have debates about whether or not a particular text really represents that writer's thoughts on poetry, or whether they evolved, or maybe there's some contradiction between what a putative Ars Poetica text says and what a poet's work does. But in this case, we don't have to guess, because MacLeish makes the purpose explicit in his title and just solves that particular problem. So this poem is an argument about what poetry should be. And the propositions are maybe not as straightforward as one might expect. In this first section, he says that poems should be wordless. One of the few things that almost everyone in poetry will agree on is that poems are made out of words. There are actually dissenters, and we sometimes see some acrobatics about what counts as a word, as language, but for the most part, you're going to be safe if you go into a room full of poets and assert that poetry has words. Along similar lines, MacLeish tells us that poems should be mute, dumb, silent. He's building what we call a trope here, which is like TV tropes in that it's a repeated pattern that crops up in multiple places, but not like TV tropes in that kids will never sit around enthusiastically documenting every instance where a poet uses related images or ideas. Anyway, we have a trope of silence. Silence and tangibility together, in fact. A poem should be palpable and mute as a globed fruit. I like to think of that as a raspberry, which is what's called an aggregate fruit, with all those little round bits, drupelets they're called, some botany trivia there for you. But it could be a grape, or an orange, or a peach, or a cantaloupe. If you're a nerd, it could be a tomato, because tomatoes are technically fruit, right? I mention all these possibilities to emphasize the physicality of the image. The globed fruit couldn't be a banana, for example, or a pineapple, or a strawberry. So, while MacLeish doesn't bring us down to one particular bin at the grocery store, he does want to trigger the physical impression of some kind of fruit with some kind of roundness to it. And that's what he's saying, that reading a poem should be somehow like holding a round piece of fruit. There are a couple cool places in this poem where MacLeish manages his image's levels of abstraction very skillfully like that, and this is one of them. So let's just hang on to that for a minute and move on to the next couple lines. He tells us that poems should be dumb as old medallions to the thumb. This goes beyond physical silence and takes us into the realm of illegibility. Say you're in a thrift shop, and you're sifting through one of those boxes of assorted odds and ends that tend to stack up in corners in thrift shops, and it's got some old military-looking medals, old coins, other little round metal things that you're not sure what they originally were, but you describe them as medallions. Sure. They're dumb in the same sense as the fruit in that they don't talk to you. Although if you do ever run across weird old coins that talk to you, send them to me, because I am definitely down to own some haunted coins. I will take any inexplicably verbal antiques off your hands. But objects like this are dumb in another way, that they clearly have some kind of meaning, some significance, but you don't know what it is. You might have to see what you could find out about the history of a particular medallion to understand what it's about, or you might need to find out about the person who originally owned it, or figure out what you could by examining it for clues really closely. What's it made out of? How old might it be? Is it linked to any other objects? And so on. You can see where I'm going with this, that poetry often asks us, challenges us really, to inform ourselves about our context if we want to get it. But MacLeish isn't just saying, hey, learn a thing, okay? Although, really, learn a thing. But it's not that poems should be readable as old medallions if we do the work to figure out how to read them. It's that they should remain unreadable in some way, that we turn them over and feel out their surfaces, and they're still mysterious. I will argue that this is one of the core characteristics of really good poetry, that while it rewards close reading, you can never quite explain all of it away. Poetry is where we grapple with the unspeakable and try to put it into words, and some trace of that thing the poet was trying to get at that cannot be said will make it into the poem. It will be present, but it won't be just transparently translatable into language. That's one way to think about why that fruit isn't specified in the first couple lines. If poetry is a fruit, it's not one that just exists out in the world that we have a name for. It escapes being tied to a single, readable, knowable object, just a little. In the next two lines, I always ask my students if anyone knows what a casement is, and almost every time the entire class will stare at me at that point like a bunch of fish who've just been yanked out of a pond. So I tell them to get out their phones and use their dictionary apps or Google and tell me what a casement is, and eventually we get that it's a particular type of window. It's those ones that open outward on hinges as opposed to the ones most of our houses have that slide up and down. This one has a stone window ledge, and someone has, or some people have, leaned out of it so many times that their sleeves have actually worn the windowsill away somewhat. And then it's been abandoned long enough that moss has grown over it. Someone who knows more about the history of architecture than I do could tell you when the last time was that stone windowsills were a normal feature of houses, but it's been a while, that I can say confidently. So this is an old structure. It's been lived in and touched for a very long time, and then aged yet more off on its own. This is one place where it's possible to interpret what MacLeish is saying as something you might want to take issue with. The stone windowsill image could mean that he wants poetry to be itself old. There's a very live debate in this period, which continues on today, about how poetry should engage with history, with older poems, with older texts, and on and on. Does it need to be full of references to classical mythology and Shakespeare's plays to be good? Full disclosure, I have lots of poems that reference classical mythology and Shakespeare. But I think the question he's getting at is more complicated than that, and that this worn stone casement wants us to think of poems as objects with rich, very human histories that, again, we can see evidence of, but not necessarily read clearly. It's not about age in an absolute sense, but about how meaning can invest and complicate words and deepen them. We're going to come back to this windowsill toward the end, so don't lose it. But look for just a second at this last piece of the first section of the poem with the word where we started, wordless. Wordless as the flight of birds. This is really a departure. It's still basically silent, but suddenly we've got motion. Again, pay attention to the physicality in each of these little bits we get. And more than just motion, what we've got is directed intentional motion. Fast directed intentional motion. Poems should go somewhere. They shouldn't just sit and be interesting, like the fruit or the medallion or the windowsill. Their silence should move. Maybe the poem carries us. Maybe it escapes us and we have to follow it. Or it just escapes, period, and we can't follow it. One meaning of flight is, after all, escape. MacLeish's ideal poem migrates somehow, or soars or plummets like a hawk diving for a lizard on the ground. Again, he chooses a word here that's concrete enough to trigger a visual image, but abstract enough to encompass a whole set of closely related images. One of the nice things about showing rather than telling is that if you're careful about how you do it, you can invoke meaning in packages like this. This is incidentally one of the reasons that people get the idea that a poem can mean anything you want it to, which is just bane of my existence as a person who likes to talk about poetry. No, 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 no. A poem can mean many things simultaneously, but they're specific and they come together and create some sort of comprehensible system. It's not a bunch of arbitrary meanings where you can just put whatever you want there. Poems are not Rorschach blots. Like the fruit, with flight here, MacLeish puts us at a level of specificity that rules in a number of things and rules out a number of others. And all the actions we could characterize as flight can coexist here as what poems should do, wordlessly, which is a strange thing to say about poems. What he may be getting at here is precisely the idea of showing rather than telling, an argument that poems shouldn't explain themselves, that poems shouldn't use words the way human beings do, even if they are made of words. The second section really has just one image in it, the moon. The moon leaving, as in departing. This gets at that aspect of flight where flight means escape. So we're picking up some of these ideas and seeing them manifest in multiple images through the poem. Poems slip away from us in our very acts of trying to read them. They're bigger than they look, like the moon in the sky, and we can't hold on to them. This section performs a fun kind of dialectical synthesis of the stillness and motion of the first section, being motionless in time as the moon climbing, so it appears, through the sky. The moon's going around the Earth, right? And the Earth itself is turning, so relative to us observers on the ground, the moon definitely moves. But at any given moment when you look at it, it looks like it's still. What's this mean for poetry? That its position changes over time. That poetry is always of a certain moment, and therefore always receding from us, as history itself does. That its appearance of stability, that sense that a poem really means something, that it's powerful and true, might be deceptive. Something like that. There's also this interesting word, releases. The moon illuminates the twigs and then lets them go, as though being in a poem is uncomfortable, and when a poem stops illuminating its subjects, that's a relief for them. Self-referentially, we can think right back to that first stanza, the fruit, the medallions, the window ledge, and the birds. This poem tells us explicitly that they're silent, that that's their nature, but it still makes them speak. And if, for a moment, we're willing to credit ideas or objects with sentience, it's not a big reach to imagine that being put into a poem, put on show, revealed, might be unpleasant. And so, when the poem lets you go, it's a liberation. We can push this farther, too. Multiple dimensions of meaning, again, independent but linked. One of the things people love about poems is that they often seem to make our own experiences clearer. Coming from that angle, the twigs of the trees are us, and then it's us being released, implying that reading a poem can somehow trap us as readers. There's a philosopher named Theodor Adorno whose thought on aesthetics has been really influential for me. He's about 10 years younger than MacLeish, so a contemporary. And late in his life, he developed a notion that one of the things that distinguishes art from other types of creative activity is that when we're the audience, the work of art has more power than we do. A sculpture or a song or a poem, this not living, created thing, somehow acts on us. And it puts its sentient human viewers, listeners, readers in the position of passive objects. It overcomes us or overwhelms us. I buy this 100%. I have completely drunk Theodore Adorno's Kool-Aid. I took the pitcher and the little Dixie cups and ran off to my cubicle in the library to consume the Theodore Adorno Kool-Aid in peace. I like this notion of art as having agency, as acting on its audience so much, not only because it chimes with my own experience, and it does, but also because it shows up all over the place in writing I admire. Here, the poem-like moon, the moon-like poem, illuminates us. And that might be a deeply ambivalent experience. Seeing oneself in a new light can be really exciting and satisfying, but it can also be discomforting, upsetting, frightening. Art pushes us out of our comfort zones. It can be a relief to get back to ordinary life. My favorite moment in the poem is this next couplet, where we're told that a poem should leave as the moon behind the winter leaves memory by memory the mind. MacLeish actually causes the words there to change their meanings multiple times in those two little lines. It's so nimble, I just love it. First, we know that this poem should be leaving as in departing. We already established that. But if we pause at the end of that line, as the moon behind the winter leaves, leaves looks like a noun. And we have the moon there behind leaves on a tree that remain through winter, like those oak trees that hang on to the previous year's leaves until the beginning of spring. The sentence carries on, though, and leaves becomes a verb again, because the moon behind the winter clouds presumably, is leaving memory by memory. Now, there isn't a line break after that phrase, but because MacLeish inverts the order we would usually expect of those two phrases, putting the modifier memory by memory between the verb leaves and its object, the mind, syntactically, we've reached the end of what could be a complete thought, that the moon is, just for an instant, with those last few words hanging together as a unit, leaving memories behind, one by one. But, as we finish the line, the grammar resolves the actual situation for us. The moon is departing from one's mind, one memory at a time, as winter goes on. Emotionally, it sort of suggests comfort. First, the moon is staying there through the winter. It's there behind the winter leaves. Okay, well, maybe not. The moon is leaving, but it's leaving us memories. No, actually, the moon is just leaving. It's disappearing from our memories itself. And it brings us down into a much more unsettling and really sad type of state. Again, 2 lines, so nimble, fantastic. If you let the poem come at you like that, piece by piece, moving in the way MacLeish says that poems move, these various meanings get raised and kind of echo around together. People will sometimes say that poets are miniaturists, and that means in part that we often look at and write about little tiny aspects of things and zoom in on them, like how moonlight moves over individual twigs on the branches of a winter tree. But it also refers to this way of handling language, manipulating meaning in extremely granular ways via individual words, individual syllables, pieces of phrases within sentences, twig by twig. Incidentally, that couplet is also an example of my all-time favorite poetry term, amphibole. It means looking both ways, and refers to cases where the placement of a line break permits a poem to raise one meaning before the line break and a second meaning after it as the reader goes on. That these things can be done and that we have highly specific names for them is the kind of thing that makes getting out of bed worthwhile, as far as I'm concerned. This particular case of amphibole does a nice job of showing rather than telling, not just with content, the images, but with its form. The poem changes meaning. It moves as we watch it through time. A much shorter period of time here than what it takes to be able to see the moon's position change in the sky, but still. You don't see a lot of word-for-word repetition in lyric poems, because they're short, and hopefully you don't need a reminder of something you read a few seconds ago. So when a poet does that, it's worth noticing. Here, we have a full sentence, 2 lines out of 8 in this section repeated. A poem should be motionless in time as the moon climbs. In a different way here, MacLeish's poem is embodying the principles for which it's arguing. That couplet is itself both fixed and mobile, moving without appearing to change. That gives me an excuse to give you another of my favorite writing terms, an autotelic text. Basically, that's a text that does what it means, or what it's about. The example I like to use is of a section in James Joyce's novel Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where he's writing about sitting through a long, excruciatingly boring sermon in church, and it is a very long, excruciatingly boring passage. You see the same idea come up in discussions of mimesis, the question of what it means to write realistically, particularly from the early 20th century forward. So, lots of poetry vocabulary here. The repetition accomplishes something that the amphibole doesn't, with respect to this dichotomy of poetry being both mobile and fixed. Those 2 lines are motionless in time, in the sense that we encounter them twice, beginning and ending the section, and while the section of words is identical, between times we get this contextualizing illustration, with the illuminating moon releasing twigs into the safety of darkness and being itself released from our memories over the course of a winter. Usually climbing, anything going upward, has a positive connotation. Cream rises to the top, climbing the corporate ladder, upperclassmen versus underclassmen, and so on. When that verb climb appears the second time, it has a different tenor, of the moon escaping us and releasing us, and all that happening imperceptibly, escaping our notice, leaving the memory. It feels maybe a little wistful or bittersweet on that second repetition. That technique of using subsequent information to transform a phrase's meaning takes us into the images in the last section. I said that we'd come back to that window. Here. For all the history of grief, an empty doorway, and a maple leaf. This echoes almost exactly the window image. It's what we call an image rhyme. You have the open window and the empty doorway, the moss, and here the leaf. The long time it takes to wear down stone, and the long time implied in the phrase, all the history of grief. We've just been thinking about the memory of something beautiful escaping, and how that might feel strangely like a relief. And grief here suddenly links together all of this poem's kind of odd-seeming little collection of images. You don't have to see the window and the door as literally part of the same house, although that's possible, but definitely see them rhyming with one another across the poem. Why did someone spend so much time leaning out of that window that they wore down its stone windowsill? Grieving. Losing someone or something you love is, of course, very painful, and there's a point where, as those memories fade, it's a bit of a relief. It's not a happy thing, but it does make going on easier. The second image here, for love, the leaning grasses, and 2 lights above the sea, confirms that the grief that's been undergirding this poem all along is about the person. These grasses have been bent by wind or by gravity in their own weight. They're not growing straight up toward the sky. They've been shifted by forces outside themselves. 2 lights above the sea is about as abstract as you can get and still summons some kind of sensory image. We don't even know whether these 2 are the same kind of lights, like 2 stars. Since we spent the middle third of the poem on the moon, it's a valid guess that one of the lights might be the moon. But if so, the other, we still have no idea. A star, a planet, a lighthouse. MacLeish is exerting more of that careful control over abstraction, And at the end here, he tells us that there's another light. Someone is left behind as that moon climbs away behind the winter. But who that person is remains mysterious. If he had characterized that second light more, been more concrete, and decided, for example, that it was a lighthouse, or that it was a star, that would put a bow on things, so to speak, and show the grief as more resolved. I can't think of any specific object that gives off light that wouldn't feel at least a little bit hopeful here. Choosing instead to leave it undefined means that, in the reality of this poem, that light is undefined. It hasn't yet figured out what it's going to be without the moon. With a lot of poems, I'll go through them, and this whole system of images about, oh, flowers and the sun, it's actually about abuse! Ha ha! And then, underneath that, it's really about writing poetry! Seriously, so many poems turn out secretly to be talking about poesis, which is the formal term for art making, and specifically poetry making. Poets, we always think that we're writing about earthquakes, or childbirth, or hanging wallpaper, and a lot of the time we're actually writing about poetry. Ars Poetica flips that trick around. It comes right out and says that it's writing about poetry, but then, once you parse out the images, there's this undercurrent of mourning that explains why that specific set of images, window, old coins or medals, moon, doorway, grass, lights, are collected together. Finally, we get this assertion that a poem should not mean but be. People often want to talk about poems in terms of, what does this mean? This image represents that, and this other image represents some other thing, and you put everything through your poetry interpretation decoder ring, and then you know what it means. And you can rattle that off for the exam. A lot of reading poetry is parsing these correspondences and looking at how they inform one another. But I'm very much in MacLeish's corner here that what a poem means is nowhere near the end of its story. A poem should not mean but be. I'll take it farther than he does even, that a poem should not mean but do. Poems like this, Ars Poetica, when they deal with powerful experiences like grief, as Shakespeare puts it, that gives them a local habitation and a name. Reading them does things to us that can help us cope. It's not like a self-help book, where you get advice and examples illustrating how to implement the advice so you can improve your life. It's something else. Poems lean on our psyches, like whatever force caused those grasses to lean. The idea both MacLeish and I are working from here is that a poem is an object, a real, existing thing. And all those correspondences and networks of meaning are components of an object, not just aspects of a larger meaning. Ambiguity, the failure of meaning, those are also part of it. The things we don't know and can never know are part of it. Good poems will give you a lot if you read them well, but there will usually be questions that you can't answer because no answer is possible. And you won't necessarily even know whether no answer is possible or if it's just that you haven't figured it out yet. Poems are bigger than the space they take up on the page. I hope you'll join me for another next week. Send me your questions, comments, poem requests, and confessions of crimes against grammar as an ask at the Tumblr, amateurbombmuseum.tumblr.com, or email them to me at amateur.bomb.museum@gmail.com. Take a look at the moon, and I'll see you next time with Richard Wilbur's poem, Junk.